I can still picture the moment like it was etched into the back of my mind. I was standing on what was supposed to be my front porch, staring at a woman who had firmly planted herself there. She was standing right between my wife, Chloe, and the doorway to our new home. She wasn't just standing there casually. She stood like a human barricade, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her chin was lifted as if she were defending a royal palace. Her floral blazer screamed middle management power trip. The way she blocked the entrance made it look like we were storming Fort Knox. Not a single golden strand of her perfectly coiffed blonde bob moved in the breeze. Her blindingly bright red lipstick could have served as a lighthouse beacon. That was my grand introduction to Susan. Susan Carmichael was the self-proclaimed ruler of the Pinecrest Valley Estates HOA. She tilted her head with that slow, disdainful smirk that makes your skin crawl. She looked at us with pure disgust. She told us she didn't care what papers we thought we had. Her tone was so condescending, it made the air feel heavier. She declared that nobody moves into this neighborhood without her personal approval. She smugly stated that she hadn't approved us yet. Chloe's fingers tightened around mine. Our shared excitement over buying our first home instantly gave way to total, utter confusion. All down the street, curtains twitched and window blinds shifted. Our new neighbors were getting front row seats to the bizarre spectacle. And we hadn't even unpacked a single cardboard box yet. My name is Ethan Carter. 3 months before this nightmare moment, Chloe and I had scraped together every cent we had. We bought our first home in a peaceful Charlotte, North Carolina neighborhood. We thought Pinecrest Valley Estates was a suburban dream. We had done our homework. It had great schools, low crime rates, and houses priced right within our reach. We were so incredibly happy. What we hadn't counted on was Susan Carmichael. She was the HOA president who apparently thought she was running her own private regime. The real estate agent had casually mentioned the HOA was active. The agent used it as a selling point, claiming they keep the neighborhood beautiful and property values stable. What she conveniently left out was how Susan treated every single new resident. Susan treated people like criminals who had to clear her personal background check before daring to exist in her kingdom. She had been president of the HOA for 7 long, agonizing years. In that time, she transformed a simple community group into her own little dictatorship. She enforced unwritten rules that appeared nowhere in the official bylaws and ran secret, aggressive committees. She had a web of nosy neighbors reporting every blade of grass that grew too tall. They even reported garden hoses that weren't the exact right shade of green. The morning of our move-in started perfectly. The sky was clear, the air was warm, and our moving truck arrived exactly on time. Chloe was practically glowing with excitement as we pulled into the driveway. We had planned this day for months. We organized every detail, took time off work, and daydreamed about finally living in a house we owned. That bliss lasted exactly 15 minutes. As soon as the movers started, Susan quickly emerged. It was like she had been hiding behind a shrub, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. She strode across her flawlessly trimmed lawn in absurdly tall heels that clicked like an executioner's drumbeat. With a clipboard in one hand and a stuffed folder in the other, she looked ready to conduct a corporate takeover. She barked at us in a shrill voice that could have easily cracked glass. She announced we could not proceed with the move until she reviewed our application and conducted proper vetting. Mike, our head mover, froze mid-step. He was a broad-shouldered, tough-looking guy. Mike had probably seen every kind of neighborhood crazy in his 2 decades on the job. The look on his face clearly said, "What on earth is happening right now?" I tried my absolute best to stay calm. I walked over with what I hoped was a friendly, non-confrontational smile. I introduced myself as Ethan and my wife as Chloe. I told her we closed on the house last Friday and there was a misunderstanding. I even pulled out the official closing documents to prove we were the legal owners. Susan barely flicked her eyes at the papers before waving them away. She acted like a queen, dismissing a lowly peasant. She stated with breathtaking arrogance that she didn't care what some bank told us. She claimed this was her neighborhood and she had procedures. She said we should have contacted her weeks ago. Since we didn't, she ordered us to remove our belongings immediately and return only after completing the paperwork. The movers looked at one another, still holding our heavy furniture in the heat. They were caught completely between professionalism and total disbelief. More neighbors began to gather around. Some were trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, while others watered perfectly fine plants. Everyone was pretending not to watch while hanging on to every single word. Chloe stepped forward. She is the calmest person I know, but I could feel the violent storm building in her rigid posture. Chloe politely told Susan she was confused about how property ownership works. She kept her voice measured, the way she does right before she loses patience. She stated, "We legally own this house." Chloe firmly said, "We do not need anyone's personal approval to live in our own home." Susan's face flushed into a shade that perfectly matched her eyeshadow. It was a chaotic mix of rage and disbelief. She shrieked, asking how dare we speak to her like that. She yelled that she is the president of this HOA and has the authority to keep undesirable elements from disrupting community standards. She boldly declared we were not moving another item into that house until she said so. Then she did the unthinkable. She stepped right in front of Mike and placed her hand flat on one of our boxers. She acted like she was going to physically stop the move herself. Mike shot me a look that basically asked if this was real life or a prank show. His patience was visibly hanging by a very thin thread. Mike told her he didn't know what her deal was, but we hired him to move our stuff, and that is exactly what he was going to do. He told her the neighborhood drama could wait until he was completely finished. Susan's response was wild. She whipped out her phone and started dialing like a sheriff in an old Western movie. She loudly declared to the whole block that she was calling the local police immediately. She claimed we were trespassing and the moving company was participating in illegal activity. She said it without even blinking, like she truly believed her own lies. Something inside me finally snapped. I've been trying to stay calm and de-escalate the situation, but hearing her threaten to have us arrested for moving into our own home flipped a switch. My sarcastic, unfiltered personality roared out. I raised my voice so every eavesdropping neighbor could hear me. I told Susan she was absolutely right and that we should definitely call the police. I offered to help her with that and pulled out my phone. I dialed 911 right there on my front porch. The dispatcher answered and asked what my emergency was. I clearly stated I needed to report ongoing harassment and the illegal obstruction of private property. I locked eyes with Susan as I spoke. I reported that a woman was physically preventing my family from accessing our legally owned home and aggressively threatening our professional moving crew. I also added that she was making false police reports about trespassing on our property. Susan's face instantly drained from beet red to paper white. She was clutching her phone, no longer eager to use it. The crowd of neighbors was growing. Some looked uneasy, while others were highly amused. Judging from their smirks, this wasn't the first time someone had finally stood up to Queen Susan. The dispatcher told me officers would arrive in about 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Susan was rifling through her folder. She muttered about regulations as if she could will authority out of thin air. Every glance she shot at me was a mix of sheer panic and rage. She was a woman realizing that, for once, she was not in control. She hissed that I had no idea who I was messing with. Her voice shook between anger and desperation as she straightened her blazer like it was armor. She claimed she had connections in this town and knew people. She swore I would deeply regret this. It was almost comical, like watching a cartoon villain deliver a dramatic monologue. She was clinging to a fantasy of absolute power that was rapidly slipping through her shaking fingers. When the police cruiser finally rolled up to the curb, Susan's demeanor flipped like a light switch. She rushed toward the officers with the enthusiasm of someone greeting their personal cavalry. She thanked them for arriving in a syrupy, innocent tone. It was a complete reversal from the screeching banshee we had just dealt with. She immediately started lying to the police officers. She claimed we were trying to move in without proper authorization, violating multiple regulations and refusing to follow procedures. 2 officers stepped out of the marked patrol cruiser. One was young and fresh-faced, Officer Cooper. The other was a seasoned woman named Officer Henderson. She had the calm expression that only comes from years of dealing with neighborhood nonsense. Officer Henderson greeted us with professional warmth and asked what the property dispute was about. I handed her our closing documents, the deed, our IDs, and our homeowner's insurance papers. I explained we closed last Friday and today was our move-in day. I pointed at Susan and said she was blocking access, threatening movers, and demanding we get her permission to live in our home. Officer Henderson studied the papers carefully while Officer Cooper took notes. Everything was straightforward and completely legal. Susan hovered just a few feet away, clutching her precious folder. Officer Henderson called out to Susan. She asked if Susan had any legal documentation giving her the right to stop us from accessing our property. Susan straightened up, her eyes gleaming with confidence. She triumphantly pulled out a thick stack of HOA bylaws. She quoted a section stating new residents must go through her approval process before occupancy. Officer Henderson scanned the papers quickly. Susan waited with a smug grin plastered across her face. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then, Officer Henderson looked up, completely unimpressed by the supposed rules. She evenly told Susan that these bylaws don't give her any authority to deny homeowners access to their property. She explained they only cover landscaping, paint colors, and architectural guidelines. The officer firmly stated the bylaws do not dictate who gets to live here, and she cannot legally prevent us from moving in. Susan's smug smirk heavily faltered. She stammered that she was the president. She claimed she had a responsibility to protect standards and that we could be criminals. Officer Cooper interjected, asking if she was actively refusing to allow legal homeowners to access their property. Susan shrilly insisted she was protecting the neighborhood and asking the hard questions. That was the moment Officer Henderson's patience completely wore out. She sharply ordered Susan to step away. She warned Susan that if she continued to interfere, she would be arrested for harassment and obstruction. Susan's eyes darted toward the crowd of dozens of neighbors, openly watching and recording. Clearly, we weren't the first people to experience her wrath. Susan muttered that it was ridiculous and retreated toward her lawn. She threatened to file complaints with the city and call her lawyer. For a brief, blissful moment, it seemed the ordeal was over. The movers went back to work. Officer Henderson returned our paperwork with a kind smile. Chloe and I exchanged a very hopeful glance. We thought we could finally start our life here in peace. We were completely wrong. 20 minutes later, just as Mike's crew was maneuvering our heavy couch, Susan reappeared. This time, she came armed like a bureaucratic bounty hunter. She carried a measuring tape, a digital camera, and a citation book. She started aggressively snapping photos of the large moving truck. She measured its distance from the curb and scribbled on her clipboard like a parking enforcer on a power trip. She loudly announced that our moving vehicle was parked illegally on the street. She claimed HOA regulations state commercial vehicles can't be parked on residential streets for more than 30 minutes without a permit. She threatened to have it towed immediately. I approached her, my patience completely gone. I reminded her the police were just here and told her to leave us alone. She self-righteously snapped back that she was enforcing legitimate rules. She claimed this wasn't about moving in, but about illegal parking. She was already on her phone, probably calling a towing company. Her vindictiveness was almost impressive in a very twisted way. I pulled out my phone and told her she was absolutely right about involving the authorities. I dialed 911 for the second time that day. It was a personal record I genuinely never wanted to set. I told dispatch it was Ethan from Pinecrest Valley Estates again. I reported that the same woman was now trying to have our moving truck towed illegally after being warned by officers to stop. This time, Officer Henderson showed up entirely alone, and she did not look amused. Susan was still on her phone when the cruiser pulled up. The moment she saw Henderson, she turned pale. Officer Henderson's tone was clipped. She asked Susan if she hadn't already explained to leave us alone. Susan defensively claimed she wasn't harassing anyone, just enforcing parking regulations. Susan insisted she had the authority to have the truck removed. Officer Henderson calmly walked over, inspected the truck, measured the distance, and verified parking regulations with dispatch. She flatly told Susan the vehicle was parked legally. She explained HOA bylaws do not override city parking laws, and she cannot tow legally parked vehicles from a public city street. She gave Susan one final warning. If she continued, she would be arrested. Susan sputtered like a fish out of water. Then she made a massive, fatal mistake right in front of the police officer. She loudly declared she didn't care what the officer said. She screamed that it was her neighborhood. She decides who lives here, and she would do whatever it takes to get rid of us. Officer Henderson just sighed heavily and reached for her metal handcuffs. She told Susan she was under arrest for harassment and the obstruction of property rights, and read her Miranda rights. The look on Susan's face was priceless. It was pure shock, like she finally realized her imaginary authority had hit a massive brick wall. She weakly protested as the handcuffs clicked into place. She cried that she was the president and was protecting the neighborhood. Officer Henderson calmly replied that being the president doesn't give her the right to harass people. As the cruiser pulled away with Susan in the back seat, the watching crowd erupted in loud cheers. Mike and his crew finally had a completely clear path to finish our stressful move. Chloe and I stood in our new driveway, hands intertwined as the last of our boxes disappeared inside. Chloe gave a shaky laugh and noted this was definitely not in any home buying guide. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was glorious. Susan was hit with severe harassment charges that cost her over $3,000 in court fines and expensive legal fees. More importantly, the HOA held a highly anticipated emergency election. Susan was decisively voted out, 87-3. The new board wasted no time rewriting the flawed bylaws completely. They made sure no future power-hungry president could ever torment new homeowners again. They even issued a formal apology to us and several other families who had suffered under Susan's regime. As for Susan, she screamed at the election meeting that the neighborhood would collapse without her leadership. She ranted that property values would plummet and everyone would deeply regret it. Security firmly escorted her out of the building as she continued to rant wildly about conspiracies and ungrateful neighbors. For the first time, Pinecrest Valley Estates finally felt like home.